Hello and welcome to my second dev diary entry of Redacted Index, previously known as Kaiser Underground. I've made a decent amount of progress over these 2 weeks, but we'll start by going over the boring project management stuff first. After actually beginning implementation, I basically immediately noticed that some of the timings on the Gantt chart just weren't realistic. I've gone and updated it again, as I'm using it as a reference for when I'm supposed to have stuff done. Whilst developing and planning my time, I realized that A2 and A3 were actually very similar in terms of content. For now, I'll combine them into a single area called A5, and I'll see if I want to make an entire new section of the game to compensate, or I'll just make A5 really big. One final thing, to complement the new Gantt chart I made, I went ahead and also made a Trello board, which lets me see the progress I've made towards each entry. Last time I mentioned that I'd be talking about the tool. Whilst I haven't actually implemented it into the game yet, I've incorporated its planned mechanics into my level design, which I'll be talking about later in the video. The tool will have 3 basic mechanics that will be introduced to the player early on: dimming, throwing, and screeching. Dimming is the basic horror game ability to toggle your flashlight. This will make it harder for enemies to spot you and will play into hidden and greater mechanics, which is something I'll also be talking about later on. Throwing the tool is heavily inspired by the Outer Wilds scout mechanic, where the player is able to toss the tool and retrieve it without having to physically pick it up. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to justify that latter part though. We'll see about that. Finally, the tool screech is the ability to make the tool loudly screech, with a bright flash to accompany it, alerting nearby enemies. This can be used as a decoy when the tool is thrown, and can be used remotely, but it'll be mainly used in puzzles, especially to do with monsters. Another key, yet slightly hidden mechanic I plan to have in the tool is that it'll be able to store the memories of the previous loops. Since the tool is actually the user of the time ability, not the player, it remembers the events that have happened in the previous loops, and this will be signified by having each loop start with the player staring into the tool to signify that it's reminding them of what happened in the forgotten past. As an actual gameplay mechanic though, the player will be able to look at the tool in their hand at any time to go over the events that have transpired over the course of the game, in a system that's also inspired by Outer Wilds, called the Tool Memories. I'll discuss how this works in the next dev diary, but it's already partially implemented and it's completely designed already. Next, let's talk about progression and greater mechanics. As a reminder, the player will progress through the game by collecting information found by wandering through areas, finding notes, graffiti, etc. The game will save and load this information and can be accessed by the player in the Tool Memories as I just mentioned. Other than that, the gameplay will remain the same every loop, other than maybe a few small conveniences, like I have one planned for the train to skip the whole sequence, if you've already seen it, and a few options with the NPC in the corridors area, which I'll talk about in a second. They might change depending on previous events, and other small things that essentially skip parts of the game that the player's already seen. In terms of actually implementing this, I've begun only adding the systems. Currently I have the bones of the whole thing in place, where I can pause the game and have logic prepared for managing the UI. This is part of milestone 1, so it is needed to play the game. So I will have this as at least barely functioning part of the game in the next video, but for now it's still in the to-do stage. I mentioned that this will be a core part of the milestone, and that's because the tool memories and the reading act as a core progression of this game, and is how the game will save/load the player's progress. Events that have been discovered/witnessed will be saved to a text file, possibly with an integer value to indicate the stage and the subplot. And to load the game, I'll simply parse the value and load it into the game with whatever event needs to happen. I redesigned the trains mechanic entirely, now using a scene system instead of a big open world route planning thing. The core stuff is there, and it only needs me to actually implement the train interior, which is something I'm leaving for later. But for now I'm using a scene system, because I realized that most of the game will involve the player wandering around tunnels and corridors, similar to Alien Isolation, which is one of the 2 key inspirations for this game, compared to the other key inspiration, Outer Wilds, which is open world, because it's set in space, and uses the emptiness as a core theme compared to the tight corridors of Alien Isolation. On top of this, because the player won't have too much vision of the rest of their environment, I can get away with leaving it as different scenes, and this will reduce the amount of work for AI, It'll give us better performance, it'll make it easier to implement special mechanics for each section, and finally, obviously, the trains will be easier to implement too. As for the enemies, I've begun designing them and their mechanics as rough sketches / concepts for now. These are only ideas right now, so other than maybe the corridor beast and the silent, they're all probably going to be scrapped or completely reworked. I plan at minimum to have 4 monsters for the final demo, and I want one to wander around the corridors, the corridor beast, attacking the player when they get stuck for too long. Another one will act as an NPC to have dialogue with, the silent, found after using a great mechanic in A5. I would also like it to interact with the corridor beast at least once as a scripted event. Another enemy will camp in areas where the player needs to understand how to bait them out so that they can progress. Maybe it'll be like a gate to the deeper parts of A1. And finally, I want one less unique type of enemy, such as like a guard type. Lore-wise, maybe it'll be something about the subjects failing to mutate properly. And these will be scattered throughout the A1 and if there's a A3 again. Finally, as an extra monster, I might implement a tracker enemy, which follows the player around and pushes them from staying in one area too long so that they don't bore themselves, and keeps the pacing decently high. After researching suspense and tension for my dissertation, I've begun planning gameplay pacing by predicting what the player might do during their loops and attempting to roughly map out how the experience will change over the course of the game. As seen on the figure on screen, gameplay pacing can be broken up into percentages of time spent and levels. But rather than doing it full levels, I'll attempt to plan it for each loop instead, and only partially depend on the player's progression, as also seen in my poorly drawn figures. As a guideline, I'll be splitting time spent into 4 categories: interacting with enemies, reading, experimentation, and exploration. To adjust the pacing of a level, I'll rework parts of puzzles, enemy pathing, and level design to match roughly what I want the player to be doing during a loop. As a quick point of reference, I want to define what a greater and a hidden mechanic is. A hidden mechanic is what it sounds like, something that isn't explicitly told to the player, but is there during gameplay. For example, whilst the basic controls for the tool will be told to the player, the tool memories will be a sort of hidden mechanic, where the player has to figure it out for themselves when they respawn. Another hidden mechanic may be that a monster is sensitive to flashing lights, so when the player is experimenting with a tool against an enemy, they might discover this just by mashing their keys. Alternatively, it may be told through notes, so everyone can discover these, but using these will allow the player to solve puzzles and make their life easier when dealing with enemies. A greater mechanic is a step up from a hidden mechanic where the ability is also innately in the player from the beginning, but might not be as obvious as a hidden mechanic. An example of which would be that the light would shift the environment if the whole area is dimmed. Another could be that you could communicate to a sensor or another enemy using Morse code with the tool dimming. I've planned out only that one light shift greater mechanic explicitly, as I detail in the next section, but I only have ideas for the second and third ones, which should be in the demo as part of their requirements. Using these mechanics will unlock a large part of the map maybe, or rewards large amounts of information to the player, as they are the milestones for the player's progression. Unlike Outer Wilds with its relatively relaxed atmosphere, I plan to opt for a safe space method, like the Resident Evil and the Dark Souls series, where the world is hostile and breaks are rare, but they serve as good points to stop, rest, and plan out your next steps in your adventure. Though, in this game, they aren't really checkpoints like they are in those games, but rather they'll be valuable points of dense and powerful information that you get to after using a greater mechanic. One safe space I've planned is the A5 NPC room where the Silent will hide, a monster which serves as a neutral character in the story, which isn't particularly friendly to the player, but if they don't interact too much with it, they aren't exactly enemies. It won't attack them. To reach this room, the player will need to understand the A5 greater mechanic, and I'll be talking about that in a second. I plan to use the 4-step puzzle design and Kishu Kentetsu methods to plan out my puzzles, or at least the bigger ones. For example, To find the great mechanic I was talking about in A5, the player will be introduced to the infinite corridors/rooms as a problem where they inevitably get stuck in the maze-like structure. This is step 1. The player is introduced to the objective, which in this case is to get out or maybe find something interesting. Step 2 will have the player introduced to the puzzle pieces, in this case the doors, rooms, and lights, and whatever info they find in notes, which ties the whole situation together. Step 3 is when the player figures out the association between these pieces, where, in this case, entering doors in an order might change the next room generated. As a Kishu Kentetsu twist, the player will need to figure out that if they disable the lights by throwing the tool to hit the lamps on the ceiling and then dimming their own light, the environment will slightly change. This will introduce the great mechanic of light shifting, where the environment will visibly change slightly when the area is completely darkened. Step 4 will have either the player walk out if they haven't found the greater mechanic, or they'll find the new shifted corridor and they'll meet the silent as a reward. In terms of actually implementing all of that, I've begun working on the largest section of A1, though I'm not particularly happy on how it's turned out. I'm having trouble designing puzzles, the scale, and the interactions of this area, so for now I'm designing A5 only, as I know what to work on there. As you can see in the video now, I've implemented the core mechanic of A5 with the repeating corridors. I'll need to work on it a bit more though to get all the intersections working correctly, especially with the puzzles I want in it. I've also settled on a subplot for this area, to do with the Silence Past. I've begun adding environmental decoration and have started planning the notes. The looping mechanic is something I've worked on before in a previous collaborative game, but I'm implementing it differently this time because I was unhappy with the final product's code last time. This time I'm using a joint method where I combine a spawner joint, which is usually maybe a door or the end of a corridor, and an entry point joint, which is the start of a corridor or a room, and I will essentially lock these in place when spawning it. I was having a bit of trouble getting them to align properly, but I ended up solving it after explicitly coding the joints to use their global positions, rather than the local positions, as parenting was actually the issue. That's all I have for this entry. Next time, at the very least, I'll have finished the reading system, worked out some of the kinks in A5, and we'll show off some gameplay of whatever I have at the time to demonstrate M1 being completed. Thanks for watching.